Now that we've done our first couple of rows of weaving, we're going to add a row of fringe, and this will actually cover those first few rows. We add the fringe by doing a row of raya knots. So to start with, we need to cut yarn that's a little bit longer than we want our fringe, and the easiest way to do that is to use a book. I'm using thinner yarn than I have used before, so I'm going to use 3 strands of yarn for each of my knots. If it was thicker yarn, you could use 1 or you could use more. I need to cut enough yarn to do a knot over every 2 warp threads, so I'm just counting those. And there are 10 pairs of warp threads. I want 3 strands of yarn for each, so I'll need to wrap this around my book 30 times. And now I'll cut the end of the yarn, slide the yarn off the book and cut them all down the middle so that I have 30 separate pieces of yarn. So for each of the raya knots, I take 3 strands of yarn. I'm going to hold it in half, and then I'm going to put the middle of the strands over 2 of my warp threads. I'm going to slow this first knot down so that you can see clearly what happens, but then I'll show some at normal speed. Take 1/2 of your strands of yarn and wrap it round 1 of the warp threads. So I go down the outside of the pair and up through the middle, and then repeat that on the other side. Once you've wrapped that around the sides, pull the threads down so that it's nice and neat, even up the ends, and you've finished your first raya knot. I'll continue along the row, filling it in with more raya knots with 1 knot over each pair of warp threads. Now I'm just going to neaten up all of those knots, and if any of the pieces of yarn are a little looser than others, I will fiddle with this to make them all even. Here I'm pulling individual strands of yarn to try to work out which is the one that is a little bit loose in the knots. These knots can come loose if they're not held in with another row of weaving. So now I'm just going to put a couple of rows of twining and then some tabby on top of it. You might just continue on with the pattern that you have planned. So I'm going to keep this video quite fast for these last few rows because there's a separate video showing you how to do the twining and the tabby. That's the weaving video number 2 in this series. If you're unsure how to do these stitches, You can look up that video. If you want to, you could do a second row of fringe above the first row, and you might even want to do that so that the fringe falls down in between your first row of fringing. So instead of doing each knot around warp threads 1 and 2 and then 3 and 4 and so on, you might do the second row of fringe around warp threads 2 and 3, 4 and 5 and so on. And that would make your fringe look a lot thicker. You might also choose to do some small areas of fringe further up in your weaving just to add texture, and you can cut your fringe quite short for that. So now we've done our fringe, followed by some twining and tabby to help hold it firmly into place.